My father kicked me out of my room to give it to my 2-year-old nephew. But when I discovered my golden child brother stole $400,000 from the company, I sent both to jail. And now they live in misery while I work at the same company that destroyed them. I'm 18 years old. I'm in my senior year of high school, and what happened a few months ago basically destroyed any illusion I had about my family. I mean, it's not like I had many from the start, but this was the final blow, you know? The thing is that my father, Thomas, always had an obvious favorite, and that favorite definitely wasn't me. It was my half-brother Brandon, who's 24 years old. And the truth is, I should start from further back, so you understand the full context of this craziness. My mom, Rachel, died when I was like 12 years old, cancer, and it was horrible, like really horrible. But what made everything worse was realizing that my father never loved me the same way he loved Brandon. Brandon is my dad's son from his first wife, and I'm from his second marriage to my mom. And, for as long as I can remember, it was always obvious that Brandon could do whatever he wanted, and I couldn't even breathe wrong without getting in trouble. My mom was like my shield. You know what I mean? She balanced things out, made sure my dad didn't treat me like garbage, but when she died, everything went to hell. My dad basically became Brandon's #1 fan, and I was just that annoying kid who lived in his house and reminded him of his dead second wife, I guess. Brandon was always the perfect son, according to my dad, even though reality was completely different. I mean, Brandon never finished college. He worked at the same tech company where my dad is a manager. Well, was a manager. We'll get to that. And basically, my dad got him the job because Brandon couldn't hold a job for more than 6 months. But in my dad's head, Brandon was this successful genius, and I was just an average student who was worth nothing. The irony is that I had better grades than Brandon ever had. I was applying to decent universities. I had real plans for my life. But none of that mattered, because I wasn't Brandon. After Mom died, I went to live with my maternal grandparents, Deanne and Walter, for a while, like a year or something, because I literally couldn't be in the same house as my dad without him treating me like a mistake. But eventually I came back because, I don't know, I felt like I should try, that maybe things could get better. Spoiler alert, they didn't get better. The next few years were basically me walking on eggshells, trying not to bother my dad, studying in my room, counting the days until I graduated and could get away to college. Then comes the moment when everything exploded. It was like 8 months ago. I was still 17, almost 18, and my dad came home one day and announced very casually that Brandon and his family were going to move in with us. Brandon had married Jessica like 2 years ago, this girl who's basically a wannabe influencer, one of those who post photos of their latte art coffee and think that's a real job. They have a son, Mason, who's like 2 years old, and apparently Brandon and Jessica couldn't pay their rent because, surprise, surprise, Jessica refuses to work and Brandon spends all his money on stupid stuff. When my dad told me this, I just thought, well, the house is big. I guess we'll all fit. How bad can it be? The answer is very bad. Very, very bad. Because 2 days later, my dad came into my room, the room where I had literally lived since I was 12 years old, the only space that felt mine, and he told me, "You need to pack your things. Brandon and Jessica need this room for Mason." And I was like, "What? And where am I going to sleep?" And he said, "You can use the couch in the basement or something. We'll figure it out." Can you believe it? He was literally giving my room to my 2-year-old nephew, who didn't even need all that space. And I, his actual son who lived there, had to sleep on a couch. And the worst part is, he said it like it was the most normal thing in the world, like I didn't matter at all. I tried to reason with him. I told him I was in my senior year of high school, that I needed space to study, that I couldn't sleep in a basement without proper heating, but he just yelled at me to stop being selfish, that Brandon needed help, and that I should be grateful to have a roof over my head. So I started packing my things because what else could I do? But while I was packing, I realized I couldn't do this. I simply couldn't live like this, without dignity, without my own space, being treated like a second-class citizen in what was supposedly my own house. So I called my grandparents, Diane and Walter, who had always been like my real parents after Mom died, and I explained the situation to them. I didn't even have to finish telling the story when my grandmother said, "Pack everything, we're coming for you right now." But before they could arrive, my dad came back into my room and saw that I was packing everything, not just moving to the basement, but clearly preparing to leave, and he got furious. He started yelling at me that I was ungrateful, that how dare I make a drama out of this, that he had given me everything, and I was repaying him with this attitude. And I, who was already fed up with his shit, told him the truth, that he had never loved me, that he had always preferred Brandon over me, that Mom was the only reason I had put up with it there for so long, and that I was going to live with my grandparents. And that's where my dad really showed who he was. He told me, "If you walk out that door, don't come back. You're not welcome here. You're no longer my son." And when my grandparents arrived, my dad literally yelled at them from the door that I had chosen to leave, that he had offered me to stay, and that I had decided to abandon my family. My grandparents didn't argue with him. They just helped me get my stuff into their truck and we left. I remember looking through the window as we drove away and seeing Brandon standing in the doorway with this satisfied smile, like he had won something. And I guess in his twisted head he had. Moving in with my grandparents was the best decision I could have made, honestly. They gave me my own room. They supported me with everything. They never made me feel like a burden. My grandmother Diane cooked amazing food and always made sure I had everything I needed for school, and my grandfather Walter drove me around when I needed it and helped me with college applications. It was like finally being in a real home, you know, where people actually cared about me. Like 2 months passed, maybe 3, and I was focused on my studies, on my college applications, trying not to think about my dad and that whole situation. My Aunt Brenda, who's my mom's sister and basically the official family gossip, kept me updated on what was happening at my dad's house without me asking. Apparently, Brandon and Jessica had turned my old room into a real mess. Jessica spent all day on Instagram and TikTok trying to be an influencer, and my dad was paying all their expenses, like food, diapers, everything, while Brandon supposedly worked but never had money. Then one day, I got a call from my dad. First time we'd talked since I left. I didn't answer the first 3 calls because honestly I didn't want to hear his voice, but eventually I answered because I thought, what the hell? Maybe he wants to apologize or something. How naive I was. The first thing he told me, without even a hello or how are you, was that he needed me to ask my grandparents for a loan, like $10,000, because Brandon and Jessica needed a new car and he had no more credit available. I stayed quiet for a second, processing the absolute audacity of this man. He had kicked me out of his house. He had told me I was no longer his son. He hadn't tried to contact me in months. And now he was calling me not to apologize, but to ask me to use my relationship with my grandparents to get him money for Brandon. I said something like, "Are you kidding? Are you seriously calling me for this?" And he got all defensive, saying it was my responsibility to help my family, that Brandon was going through a tough time, blah, blah, blah. I hung up on him. I blocked his number. I thought that would be the end of it. But oh no, this was just getting started. Like a month after that call, I got a call from Alexander, who's the CEO of the company where my dad worked. Alexander had been my mom's friend. They met when she worked there before having me, and he had always been good to me. Like he'd ask how school was going when I saw him at company events and stuff. He asked if we could meet for coffee, that he needed to talk to me about something important. We met at a Starbucks near my grandparents' house, and Alexander looked super serious, uncomfortable even. He told me he had discovered that Brandon had been stealing money from company accounts, like small but frequent transfers that added up to thousands of dollars, like 30,000 or something over several months. He said that my dad, as manager and Brandon's direct supervisor, must have known, or at least should have noticed, and that he was investigating whether my dad was involved or had just been negligent. I sat there with my Frappuccino, completely in shock. I mean, I knew Brandon was useless. I knew my dad spoiled him too much. But actual theft, like actual crime, I didn't expect that. Alexander told me he was telling me because he respected my mom and because he wanted me to know this was going to blow up soon, that there would probably be legal consequences, and that he didn't want me to be caught off guard if my dad or Brandon tried to contact me. I didn't have to wait long. Literally 2 days later, like at 10 at night, someone knocked on my grandparents' door. My grandfather went to open it, and there were my dad and Brandon, both looking absolutely desperate. My dad started begging them to let him talk to me, that it was an emergency, that they needed my help. My grandparents told them to leave, but I came downstairs because I wanted to hear what excuse they were going to make up. My dad started with his usual drama, saying he was so sorry, that he had made a mistake kicking me out, that I was his son and he would always love me, blah blah blah. Pure lies, he didn't even believe himself. And then he got to the real point. He told me Brandon had made a mistake at work, that there were some problems with some accounts, and that they needed me to talk to Alexander and tell him it was all a misunderstanding, that Brandon hadn't stolen anything, that it had just been an administrative error. I stood there looking at them, at my dad with his fake desperation face and at Brandon who couldn't even look me in the eye, and I felt this wave of satisfaction, like pure justice. My whole life, my dad had treated me like garbage while putting Brandon on a pedestal, and now that Brandon had screwed everything up in the most stupid way possible, they were coming to me for help. I told them very calmly, "Do you really think I'm going to lie for him? After everything you did to me?" And my dad tried the manipulative approach, saying that if Brandon went to jail, it would be my fault, that Mason was going to grow up without a father because of me, that I was destroying the family. And I just laughed. I literally laughed in his face, and I told him, "You destroyed any relationship with me months ago when you kicked me out to give my room to Brandon. So no, I'm not going to help you. I'm not going to lie for a thief, and you can leave my property now." My grandfather, Walter, who's the most patient man in the world, told them if they didn't leave, he'd call the police, and they left. But not before my dad yelled at me that I was selfish, that someday I'd regret this. Basic threats from someone desperate. I thought that would be it, but oh boy, I was wrong. For the next 2 weeks, my dad called me from like 5 different numbers, all blocked, sending me text messages, emails. He even showed up at my school once trying to talk. To me. My grandparents were considering a restraining order when Alexander intervened. He called my dad and basically told him that if he didn't stop harassing me, Alexander would personally make sure he faced additional legal consequences for harassment, and that he already had enough evidence to ruin his life without needing to add more charges. That calmed him down for a while, but then my Aunt Brenda called me with juicy information. Apparently, Brandon hadn't only been stealing through digital transfers, he had also been using the corporate credit card to buy personal stuff, like a PlayStation 5, an Apple Watch, expensive clothes, expensive restaurant dinners with Jessica, basically living a life he couldn't afford with money stolen from the company. And all this while telling my dad he needed more financial help, that they could barely survive. Pure lies. I decided that if Brandon was going to be exposed, he was going to be completely exposed. I talked to Alexander and asked him if I could get evidence of all of Brandon's purchases with the corporate card. Alexander told me he already had everything documented for the legal case, but he sent me copies of some receipts. They were obscene. Brandon had spent like another $20,000 on pure junk, while my dad sacrificed everything to support them, and while supposedly they didn't have money even for food. I took that evidence and sent it to Jessica by email. I told her the complete truth, that Brandon had been stealing from his job, that they were going to proceed legally against him, that he was probably going to go to jail, and that all the money he claimed to be earning working hard was actually stolen money. I sent her screenshots of the purchases, dates, amounts, everything. I told her that if she had any common sense, she should take Mason and get out before the whole mess dragged her down too. I don't know if it was because of the email or because she finally realized on her own, but Jessica left Brandon 2 days later. She packed her things, took Mason, and went to live with her parents in another state. My Aunt Brenda told me the scene was dramatic, Jessica screaming at Brandon in front of my dad, calling him a liar and a thief, saying she wasn't going to stay with a criminal. Brandon apparently cried, literally cried like a baby, begging her to stay, promising he'd fix everything, but she left and blocked all his contact attempts. But I wasn't done. I also took evidence of Brandon's lifestyle, his Instagram posts where he showed off expensive things, Jessica's photos at fancy restaurants, trips they had taken, and sent them anonymously to some of his friends with a simple message. Ask him where he got the money for all this, when supposedly he couldn't even pay rent. His reputation went down the drain almost immediately. His friends started cutting contact, people started talking. He basically became a social pariah. Alexander finally proceeded with criminal charges against Brandon. And since my dad was his direct supervisor and had signed some documents that should have prevented the theft, he also filed charges against him for criminal negligence and possible complicity. My dad lost his job immediately, obviously. Brandon too, duh. But that was the least of it considering he was probably going to face prison time. The most satisfying part of all this was when Alexander offered me a paid internship at his company for the summer before going to college. He said he had seen my work ethic, my honesty, and that I was exactly the type of person he wanted on his team. The irony of getting a position at the same company where my dad had just been fired from and where Brandon had stolen from wasn't lost on me, and apparently not on my family either. My Aunt Brenda kept me updated on the continuing disaster. My dad had to sell his house because he couldn't pay the mortgage without a job and with legal expenses piling up. He moved to a small, cheap apartment. Brandon was living with him. Both of them basically miserable, waiting for the trial. Jessica had started divorce proceedings and was asking for full custody of Mason, which she was probably going to get considering Brandon was a convicted criminal in waiting. They tried to contact me a few more times, always with the same message. That I had destroyed the family. That everything was my fault. That if I had helped, none of this would have happened. But the reality is they destroyed themselves. Brandon chose to steal. My dad chose to enable and protect a thief. I just chose not to be complicit in their crimes and their terrible behavior. It's been a few months since all this. I'm starting college in the fall. I have a partial scholarship, and with the money I earned in the internship, plus what my grandparents helped me with, I'm going to be fine. Alexander has become something like a mentor, like a real father figure, something my dad never was. My grandparents are proud of me. They support me in everything, and honestly, my life is much better without the toxicity of my dad and Brandon in it. Do I feel bad about what happened? Not really. Should I? Maybe some people would think so. That I should have helped my family no matter what. But the thing is, they were never really my family, you know? My family is my grandparents. It's Alexander. It's the people who actually care about me and support me. My dad and Brandon only shared my blood, nothing more. The last update I had was like 2 weeks ago. Brandon's trial is scheduled for next month. He's probably going to accept a plea deal because the evidence against him is overwhelming. Like there's literally a digital record of every illegal transfer he made. My dad faces minor charges, but still is probably going to have a record, which means getting another decent job is going to be almost impossible for him. His reputation is ruined, his finances are in ruins, and he lost his favorite son in the process. I'm going to be honest, there's a part of me that feels something like pity when I think about how my dad basically destroyed his life for Brandon. But that part is very small. But the bigger part of me just feels relief. Like I'm finally free from that toxic dynamic where I was always the bad guy. And Brandon could do whatever he wanted without consequences. Eventually the consequences came. Just way worse than anyone could have imagined. Sometimes, I think about how things would have been if my mom were alive. She would never have let my dad treat me like that. She would never have allowed Brandon to get away with stealing and being a general deadbeat. But I also think that maybe all this had to happen for me to realize that I don't need my dad's approval, that I can build my own life with people who actually value me. Last week, I was organizing my stuff for college and I found an old photo from when I was like 8 years old, before Mom got sick. We were all there. My dad, my mom, me, even. Brandon was there, even though he was already an adult at that time. All smiling, looking like a normal family. It made me think about how things can change so much, how people can show who they really are when circumstances get tough. I kept the photo, not because I miss those times, but as a reminder that appearances deceive, that real family isn't just shared blood. My grandparents asked me recently if I would ever forgive my dad. I told them the truth. I don't know. I can't forgive someone who hasn't even admitted they did anything wrong, who still thinks I'm the villain in this story. And honestly, I don't need to forgive him to move on with my life. I'm fine. I'm going to be better. And that's enough. I guess if there's any lesson in all this, it's that you don't owe loyalty to people who don't respect you, no matter what relationship you have with them. That it's okay to walk away from toxic situations, even if it means losing what's left of your family. That actions have consequences, and eventually people reap what they sow. My dad sowed favoritism, negligence, and protection of a criminal. Brandon sowed theft, lies, and entitlement. Now they're reaping the consequences. And I'm here, building my own life, free from their drama. I start college in 3 months. I'm going to study computer science, maybe business as a minor. Alexander already told me he has a place for me in his company after I graduate, if I want it. My grandparents are planning to help me move into the dorm. Everything is falling into place in a way that never would have been possible if I had stayed at my dad's house, being treated like garbage. And my dad and Brandon, they can screw off, honestly. They made their bed, now they can sleep in it. I'm going to be here, living my best life, being successful, surrounded by people who actually love me. That's the best revenge, I guess. I don't need to do anything else to them. They already destroyed themselves. I just refuse to be dragged down with them.